Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. This webinar today, we're talking about the boosting grid reliability and affordability through transmission. My name is Adria Brooks. I'm the Director of Transmission Planning at Grid Strategies. We also have my colleague here, Zach Zimmerman. Our team at Grid Strategies just released 2 reports on these topics, funded in part by ACEG and Grid United. We're going to go through just a really quick, like 5-minute presentation on each for both these reports. We clearly cannot do the reports justice in 5 minutes. We're just going to give you an overview of it, and then we're going to jump into a really great panel, trying to reserve the majority of the time for Q&A with our panel today. So I'll get started by introducing Zach. He'll present on the affordability report. I will present on a resource adequacy report, and then after that, we will introduce the panelists. Again, thank you all for being here. So Zach is the research and policy manager for Grid Strategies, focused on economic and regulatory analysis related to power markets and transmission. His work includes writing reports. I'm sure many of you have seen his name or seen him on webinars. Zach puts out a ton of reports for us. And then he also works on several of our coalitions, such as the Advancing Modern Power Lines, or the AMP coalition, as well as the Working for Advanced Transmission Technologies, or WAT coalitions. Prior to Grid Strategies, Zach worked as a committee legislative assistant for the Minnesota House Energy and Climate Committee. And with that, Zach, I'll pass it to you.
Great. Thanks, Adria. Let me take 1 second here to share my screen. Okay, can you see those slides? Okay.
We got him. Thanks.
Great. All right, excellent. So yes, thank you for that introduction, Adria, and thank you to ACEG for supporting all of this work that we've done in these 2 reports. So I'll be starting off the webinar today discussing our report looking at affordability for consumers and how large-scale transmission deployment can save consumers money on their electric bills. So the impetus for this report, as I'm sure you've all heard, we've done work on load growth and have found that over the past 3 years, the load forecasts have tripled essentially. We also have an aging grid that's starting like kind of reinvestment cycle in terms of replacing aging assets. And then we've also seen decreasing rates of investment in high capacity transmission over the past decade, which are some of the most efficient transmission investments and something that we'll discuss on a later slide. There's also been recent survey data that's shown 3 in 4 Americans are concerned about rising utility bills. So it's within that context that we wanted to put do some research and kind of look at what the benefits that transmission can actually provide to consumers. So at a high level, our analysis found that well-planned transmission expansion could save US households across the country 6.3 to 10.4 billion in electric bill savings, and that is after accounting for the cost of the transmission itself. So that's the blue bar, and then the gray bars you see here are that when many of these transmission plans are reevaluated, we often see that those benefits can be 20 to 40% higher than initially projected. So reevaluation finds that the initial transmission plans are often more beneficial than expected. To get these numbers, we drew on reports from across the country, from regions including ISO New England, NISO, which is in New York, PJM, which is the Mid-Atlantic states, CERTEP in the Southeast, MISO and SPP, and also ERCOT. So using benefit cost analysis from transmission plans within those regions, we were able to put together an estimate of benefits and costs, and then apply that to average residential household electric bills using EIA data. From that data, we were able to kind of give a breakdown here of the actual bill or average bill impacts that a residential consumer could expect to see from some of these well-planned transmission expansions. So on net for the year, residents can expect to see between $44 and $73 in savings from these transmission plans. So as you can see here, a relatively modest increase in spend on transmission, about 1% of the annual bill, leads to approximately 6% in savings in generation costs. So that's voided generation, which is a benefit that Adria will go into, but also more efficient use of the existing grid through power and load sharing. Beyond that, we also found some other benefits of large scale and well-planned transmission. So there are significant economies of scale within high capacity transmission. So 765 kV lines, which are the current transmission plans in Texas, and MISO, SPP, and PJM also have plans to build 765 kV lines. These lines drive 75% in savings for consumers. They deliver power on a per megawatt mile basis much more cost effectively than lower voltage lines, and so we find that there are significant benefits when high voltage lines are included in transmission plans. I will, as Adria said, it's a quick 5 minutes here to do this overview. But one of the other key benefits that we wanted to talk, that I'll end on, and then kind of transition to Adria, is this map of the value of transmission kind of across the country. This is a map that Jeff always includes in his presentation, so I'm sure he'll talk more about it as well. But transmission also does a lot to improve grid reliability and resilience. And so it impacts load shedding events, which are power outages during extreme weather, and also increases access to resources between neighboring regions. Again, this Adria will focus more on this, but these extreme weather events can lead to significant price spikes for consumers. There can be very severe congestion impacts during extreme weather events, and also power losses lead to loss of heating and cooling facilities or ability to refrigerate things like food and medication. So power outages have significant impacts on consumers, and there's a lot of value within a concentrated number of hours for these for transmission lines. So you can kind of think of this as an insurance risk or insurance policy, something like life insurance, where you invest a little bit on a monthly basis, and it yields significant benefits when you have these extreme events. With that, I will turn it over to Adria to talk about her report on resource adequacy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zach. All right, so as Zach mentioned, our second report, well, I should say Zach released his today, so just hours ago, hot off the presses. This report, the Resource Adequacy Value of Interregional Transmission, came out last week in time for the FERC Technical Conference on Resource Adequacy, which we'll get into in Q&A. This slide deck is part of a much larger deck that we're working to put online, so don't feel stressed to have to write everything down. It will be posted. So the report is broken into really four parts. The first part is the role of transmission in supporting resource adequacy. The second part, capturing the value of interregional transmission for resource adequacy, and then recommendations for planners and regulators. Now in the appendix is the current resource adequacy practices, specifically to transmission, interregional transmission across the United States. So this report, along with Zach's, can be found at the link that you see here. And again, we're going to get this deck online to accompany the report. Very briefly, just to give a high level of what we mean when we say interregional transmission can support resource adequacy. It does that by enabling neighboring regions with different resource mixes and different times of peak load to share their internal resource capacity with one another. So that allows that capacity to be shared between regions, even without building new generation, which is really important. Resource adequacy is predominantly a generation issue, but on the margins, which are very expensive, interregional transmission plays a huge role, and it can support that even without new generation being built. Now, consumer benefits, as Zach was discussing, from the sharing of reserves. So consumers do benefit from that, not only the improved reliability, but also those reduced costs. So again, if we can lower the amount of internal capacity that has to be built by 5, maybe even 10%, because we're able to share resources across borders, that can have huge economic savings. And then finally, these reliability and economic benefits are heightened during times of grid stress when resource adequacy really matters, because the transmission assets tend to be available 100% of the time. We've seen through historical extreme events that the generation resources tend to be impacted more than the transmission system. So that is a really valuable resource during those storms. Now, system planners already incorporate some capacity value of interregional transmission into their resource adequacy assessments. Many system planners, not all, but many, do calculate a reduction in loss of load expectation, that LOE, or the planning reserve margin associated with the fleet of interregional ties that exist between their region and a neighbor. However, not many planners have calculated that LOE or PRM reduction from individual transmission facilities, nor have they converted that loss of load or the PRM reduction into a capacity value the same way that they calculate capacity value for generation resources. So the table on the left is a roll-up of a handful or many of the planning regions throughout the United States and the way that they do or do not account for firm or non-firm imports into their region, and then how much do they credit that capacity. There are emerging methods to calculate the capacity value of interregional transmission. Now, of course, there's no consistent way to accredit that for the RI value across all the regions, but some proven methods have emerged, notably the effective load carrying capability method, which many regions are starting to turn to now to accredit their generation resources. It can also be used to accredit interregional transmission and the resource adequacy value of that transmission. So on the right is a table of a roll-up of a handful of really large interregional transmission lines, both domestically and internationally. And the way that ELC or another method can be used to accredit that capacity that they bring into a region, as well as their capacity value. So this capacity value is not well accredited here in the United States, but it is internationally, and we talk about that in the report. Then the recommendations for system planners and regulators first account for these transmission-enabled imports and resource adequacy assessments. That can include the contribution using LOE or planning reserve margin reductions, right? These are metrics that are already being used in resource adequacy today. We do recommend using neighbor-specific and stress period data and probabilistic methods for those imports. Second, quantify the transmission capacity of major interregional transmission facilities. Again, use existing RA metrics, so LOE, expected unserved energy, whatever the RA metric is in that region, to calculate that capacity value for these lines. You want to apply seasonal and neighbor-specific accreditation because not all neighbors' diversity is the same, right? So you want to capture that diversity with each neighbor by accrediting it separately. And then we suggest that FERC could expand on the methods already developed in NERC's Interregional Transfer Capability Report to support this effort. And then finally, we want to enable procurement and development of interregional transmission lines that support resource adequacy, right? If we don't procure it, if we don't encourage the development, then we're going to miss out on this really valuable opportunity. So there's many ways to do this. It can be done via rate-based recovery, load-serving entity obligation reductions, or direct compensation to the developers of those lines. And of course, with all things electric industry, regulatory oversight might be needed because of a misalignment of incentives. Want to be sure that ratepayers are getting the benefit. And I am going to stop us here such that we can open it up for the Q&A. I want to encourage folks to put their questions into the Q&A in the chat, and then we'll try to get to questions as we go, but we'll reserve a little bit of time at the end, certainly, for a conversation with our panelists. So all of our panelists are coming on screen now. I'll go through introductions and we'll start in on the questions. So first we have Carrie Zalewski, who is Vice President of Transmission and Electricity Markets at American Clean Power, where she advances clean energy through policies that ensure fair access to the electricity markets. Previously, Carrie served as the chair and agency head of the Illinois Public Utility Commission, where she brought her experience as an energy attorney, engineering degree, and over 15 years of experience in environmental and energy regulation. Next, we have Jeff Dennis, who's the Executive Director of Electricity Consumer Alliance, a coalition dedicated to advancing consumer-centric solutions to modernize the grid, supporting economic growth and the development of digital infrastructure and advanced manufacturing. Importantly, keeping electricity affordable and reliable for all users. Previously, Jeff was the Deputy Director of Transmission at the Grid Deployment Office, where he, among other things, was my former boss, facilitated transmission deployment, supported robust transmission planning, and addressed transmission siting and permitting challenges to ensure grid reliability and resilience. Prior to that, he spent over a decade in leadership roles at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Next, we have Madeline Gold-Laughlin, who is Director of Regulatory Affairs at Grid United. She supports the successful execution of Grid United's portfolio of transmission projects by developing and leading the company's regional transmission operator and state utility engagement and policy strategies. Prior to joining Grid United, Madeline led policy and regulatory affairs at Enel North America, where she was responsible for managing regulatory risk of all business and product lines in the state of Texas. All right, finally, we have Commissioner Katie Dykes, who currently leads Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, known as DEEP, since 2019. Commissioner Dykes previously served as the chair of the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority and as Deputy Commissioner for Energy at Connecticut DEEP. She serves in board positions for the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO, the New England State Committee on Electricity, and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Katie joined Connecticut DEEP in March 2012 after prior service at the White House Council of Economic Quality and also at the U.S. Department of Energy. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to start off with just a round robin, so I'll just go in the order that I gave the introductions to. So Carrie, we'll start with you. I'd like to know, how do you describe the current state of regional and interregional transmission, and what needs to be done better?
Hi, good afternoon, Adria. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the great question. I think everyone on this panel could agree that the current state is not good. I've heard the statistic, and I do think it's covered in your report, that 55 miles of transmission were built in 2023 and 275 miles were built in 2024. And this is a real problem. When we think about transmission and the benefits it brings to all, we often think about reliability, what happens if the lights go out, if there's not enough transmission. But I do think affordability needs more attention. So I'm really, really happy that you put together that report. When we think about impacts on communities, in Winter Storm Uri, when power went down from 2 to 3 days and 250 people died, like, there are real consequences when there's outages. Now, Winter Storm Uri had a lot more going on than transmission issues. It was a lot more on the generation side, but we just recently saw a load shed event in New Orleans because of transmission. Power went out for about 3 hours. It's my understanding there was no death or physical harm, but I think that's a glimpse into what's to come. There simply is not sufficient transmission build out in New Orleans to another part. They're in the MISO South region, and a lot more needs to be done. There's been a lot of really good ideas of what we can do to help move the ball forward. We always talk about the planning and the permitting and the paying, but a couple of things that I always like to speak to is education and ensuring that state commissioners are empowered in this conversation. So when state commissioners get together and they try to do regional planning, so lines that are within a certain market, and it comes down to cost allocation, and even if we all agree that only the beneficiary pays, what is a benefit, who pays it, how much, is a really, really tough conversation, understandably, because every single penny that goes on the bill is something that you have to defend, whether you had control over it or not. So you're always the first line of attack by the public, by the governor, by elected officials. And so I think making sure that they have a seat at the table. And then, of course, when you have a conversation between regions, it even gets more difficult because you're even spreading it out amongst more people. So I think they need to be empowered and part of the conversation. But at the same time, I do think that what would be helpful is to have some authority, whether enacted by Congress, to have a stopping point, like a backstop, like an authority that can make sure that all the voices have been heard and then a decision is made. This was something that EPRA bill was kind of trying to get to, is making sure there was someone to kind of referee. So strong voices for state regulators, but also making sure there is a final goal and a way to make sure that things like cost allocation has a goal line.
Great, thank you. Jeff, over to you. You get to defend the map.
You know what? I'll save the map for later because it's so much fun. Thank you for the invite. It's great to be with you all. Great to be on Teams with Adria again. Brings back fond memories. So I agree with a lot of what Carrie said. I mean, we're behind when it comes to transmission, is what I would say. I think what I'll add to what Carrie said is when I look at planning processes, I think a lot about comprehensive planning processes in this new role, working on behalf of customers, because we have significant load growth coming. Meeting that load growth is a national security imperative. Much of it is driven by the need for us to win the artificial intelligence race, to build a digital economy. And transmission is going to be a big part of that. And it's going to do those two competing things that we talk about in our mission, which is making sure we have the infrastructure we need for economic growth and development while keeping rates affordable for customers. But we need good comprehensive planning processes in order for us to identify those projects that do both of those things. And there's a lot of them out there. I think regional planning is improving. It's uneven, I would say, but improving in many regions. I think where we're really behind is interregional transmission, and a lot of what you heard in the two presentations earlier, Adrian, your presentation in particular, we're just behind. We don't have a planning process. What we know is that there are massive benefits to good interregional transmission projects that help us move energy from where it's available to where it's needed, whether it's in a winter storm like Carrie talked about, or whether it's just the need to access lower cost power supplies for consumers. So, I think if you're someone who's thinking about how does America win the AI race, I think interregional transmission is part of that supply chain for artificial intelligence. If you're thinking about how do we keep rates affordable, I think it's really well planned interregional projects that capture a lot of value. We're seeing some of those projects move forward. It's mostly from, frankly, entrepreneurs who are finding those opportunities and then doing the really patient work to move them forward. I think additional planning processes in these areas that help us more systematically identify those opportunities is a great need right now.
Great, thank you. How about you, Madeline?
Yeah, so again, thank you for having me and joining this discussion. I think it's incredibly important. Many of the projects that Grid United is focused on developing are these projects of an interregional nature. And I think, part of the reason and our motivation for developing these projects is they can deliver some of the highest value in multiple regions, but for a multitude of reasons, people have kind of shied away. They're very difficult projects. It requires coordination amongst a multitude of stakeholders. And while, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, we are improving some of these regional planning processes and looking a little bit longer term and trying to coordinate within the region, there's still a lack of coordination between regions. And that's what we're seeing with some of the projects that we're developing. And that's ultimately harming the ability to build out some of the highest value projects, because being able to deliver power over greater distances is able to take advantage of greater diversity in terms of load and supply. It's able to build this grid that is bigger than the weather. And so these are the types of projects that we should be focused on. We always want to be mindful of ultimate costs to the consumer in this age where there's going to be a significant amount of investment and build out in grid infrastructure. And I think right now a lot of the focus is on these very large oftentimes scary for regulators and other stakeholders, load forecasts that we're looking at with rapid amounts of load coming online very quickly. And interregional transmission is a bit of a hedge or an insurance policy against many folks' fears of potential overbuild or misallocation of costs. Being able to move power between regions, in particular the types of bidirectional HVDC lines that Grid United is building, is able to then kind of hedge against, okay, this region slightly over forecasted, this region slightly under forecasted, let's move the power efficiently, let's build out a cost-effective grid. We obviously need to build generation, but interregional transmission connecting that generation can do things in a bit more of an efficient manner.
Great. I really appreciate that you were able to explain like why power sharing between regions is important and helpful. Commissioner Dykes, over to you.
Great. We'll also echo the appreciation for these papers and shining the light on the affordability and resource adequacy benefits of transmission investment. I'm delighted to be here to offer a perspective from states. And frankly, I think that some of these fundamentals around how to, ways that transmission can help us lower costs and address reliability risks that are more and more evident is what's motivated states like mine here in Connecticut to work even more constructively with our neighboring states across regions to do that. Do the grunt work of helping to address some of those things that have contributed to us falling behind, if you will, on transmission investment. First of all, figuring out how to divide the costs is something that has delayed projects from moving forward. And we've made some strides on that here in New England recently around cost allocation, just by recognizing that, scoring the reliability benefit is something that can help unlock equitable agreement around cost sharing, even notwithstanding whether a project is meeting a public policy goal of a particular state. So getting back to some of those fundamentals around reliability and affordability, I think opens a path to help speed agreement on how to pay for that transmission. I have to say, we've also, had a lot of success with our recent Northeast States collaborative on transmission. Over the last 2 years, we've been working on 2+ years. We've been working together on some of these other barriers, including working to try to align some of the planning standards across the different RTOs that some of our states from Maryland to Maine are operating in. That is a kind of a basic step, a building block to help us better share power and wield power across regions, across existing transmission, as well as to help develop more interregional transmission. We certainly are, we have a lot more to do. We recently announced a work plan for that collaborative, where we're hoping to issue an RFI, engage the potential for building more no regrets interregional transmission projects between New England and New York and PJM. So we're certainly really interested to see these papers coming forward and highlighting, I think, what has really been a big driver for the states in working together. There's lots more to do. I'm hopeful that this focus on interregional transmission will help us better standardize some of the components that we're utilizing for our transmission builds, as we know that supply chain backlogs are also impacting the cost of transmission projects. There's just, once you get these sort of multi-state collaborations underway, you find that there's kind of engines of, breaking down even more barriers and tackling even more challenges. Success sort of begets success, and collaboration begets collaboration. So I'm optimistic for what we'll be able to accomplish, but it really goes back to, the fundamentals of reliability, resource adequacy, and cost, bringing a diverse set of states together. And I think that that's replicable across lots of parts of the country.
That's great. Thank you. We're going to pull on threads from probably everything from your intros. But Jeff, you are going to have the first thread pulled. You did talk about kind of piecemeal transmission planning that we do today. What are some of the risks of continuing with that piecemeal or reactive planning and development?
Yeah, I think the biggest risk that we see in that kind of piecemeal reactive development is that we end up really just chasing near-term reliability exigencies that require a solution. And don't misread me to say that we should not be meeting reliability imperatives. Of course, we have to. I'm not criticizing what needs to be done to keep the lights on. But these piecemeal projects are typically planned independently by individual utilities to meet those near-term reliability needs. They're a category that are often called local projects or supplemental projects. And so they fall outside of a planning process that would assess these projects in light of other benefits that they could provide so that we can identify cost-effective solutions that meet multiple customer needs across a broader area. And so, it's really the biggest risk. And what we're seeing is data showing that these local kind of supplemental projects are becoming a bigger and bigger part of transmission spending in this country, growing to over 60% of all transmission projects. A recent complaint filed at FERC points out in PJM alleges that these projects, they're called supplemental projects in PJM, total over $18 billion in costs between now and the end of 2028. And so those are real dollars that will show up in consumer bills, and they really come with little oversight because they aren't coming through that planning process that could have ensured we meet those reliability needs while also providing other benefits like reduced power production costs that Zach talked about, and I know we'll talk about a lot more. So, I think that's the risk, and that's the risk when we fall behind in doing that good planning I talked about earlier.
Great, thank you. Madeline, to you, you did talk about the sharing of power generation between regions and how that's really important for providing a hedge, things like that. But I want to dig in a little bit there, in part because I feel like over the last, I'm not sure, 8-10 years, there's been this myth that has emerged that interregional transmission really only helps clean energy or renewable energy. That just simply isn't the case. Can you explain a little bit more about how interregional transmission is important across all generation types?
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. There was this kind of previous construct that interregional transmission was associated with increased renewable build out, that you only needed these long distance lines to bring power that was generation that was being located far distances away from load. However, that's just not the case, and that's not the grid of today. What we're seeing now is with whether it be extreme weather or just changing load profiles of regions, used to have this kind of relatively simple system to operate where you were either a summer peaking system or a winter peaking system. Now you have what were traditionally shoulder seasons of fall or spring. Those seasons are compressed, and those were really critical time periods for large dispatchable generation to perform critical maintenance that was required in order to be able to perform at the capacity accreditation and give the resource adequacy value that region ultimately needed. So with these shoulder seasons being compressed, these generators being required to run virtually 24/7 in some cases to meet these new peaks and kind of constant peaking system, that ultimately wears and tears on those generators, makes them unable to perform and kind of miss critical capacity or resource adequacy hours when the system needs it most. And so increasing connectivity via interregional transmission allows those generators to take the necessary maintenance, take the downtime in order to, on those 1-2 days a month where there's more extreme peaking events, you can bring in power from another region that is not seeing those same peaks. And you're able to kind of reduce the overall stress to the system, which benefits, all generation types. And again, with those generators, increasing transmission reduces potential for curtailment, allows that generation to actually reach the areas where it's needed most. And potential outages. So that's where you can really see the value of these connections.
That's great. Yeah, that reduced shoulder season and the lack of interregional transmission really came up, most notably in the investigation about the outages in New Orleans. So that's been a big part of the discussion. And then also, of course, was raised at last week's FERC Resource Adequacy Technical Conference. And Carrie and Katie, you all both had the opportunity to participate in that. So I want to turn to you all to get your reactions to what you heard during the technical conference. But first, Commissioner Dykes, can you please explain what resource adequacy is? Like, let's take that step back. And how does transmission help maintain that? Just building a little bit onto what Madeline said. And then please, your reactions to the conference.
Super. So the way I think about resource adequacy, it boils down to having enough electricity, enough power or sources of supply in the right times and at all times to cover the real time and changing demands on the system and keep the lights on. It's typically discussed in terms of capacity, which at its most basic is the theoretical ability to provide energy at a future point in time. But in the real world, issues can crop up like unplanned outages or fuel shortages. That means this capacity is unable to be converted into energy in real time when it's needed. And so transmission plays an essential role in this balance for multiple reasons. I mean, this really is the story of the grid, is expanding connections between different generators, generating locations through this web of transmission that has grown into, you know, the most complex and impressive engineering, you know, feat of mankind, frankly. And it's you know, today, meaning that we can bring, you know, we have transmission needs to bring energy to locations that may not have the ability to generate power, for example, from renewable resources. We can interconnect, you know, wind-rich and solar-rich locations to more distant cities and towns that need that power. And so we've focused a lot on how to ensure that the transmission system is keeping up with the deployment of renewable energy to meet our public policy goals here in Connecticut and New England. We know that transmission can reduce curtailment of some of those types of intermittent resources. But I want to stress, and I think the papers here and the discussion here also uncovers that the transmission build out we're talking about and that we need to address, you know, our competitiveness in the AI space and so on, is not just about renewable resources. There's significant benefits from interconnecting all types of generation across various parts of the country. And I think if you were listening in on the technical conference on resource adequacy last week, I was, you know, really pleased to get to participate in that conversation. We know that there's a lot of focus on how we can make sure that our markets are functioning in restructured states to incent the development of the new supply sources that are needed and to accurately project where demand is going to show up over time and address some of the barriers like interconnection queues that may be slowing the realization of some of these different generation resources onto the grid. I was really impressed with the detailed questions and conversation that was coming from the FERC commissioners and from all of the different panelists. We know that there's still a lot that needs to be resolved, but I think it was a very constructive conversation about how markets can evolve to not only ensure that we have the right investment signals for generation where it's needed, but also for transmission.
Great. Carrie, you're able to build on that a little bit. How do we think about this co-optimization of the generation we need for resource adequacy as well as the transmission choices? And then again, please give your thoughts on the technical conference from last week.
Yeah, thank you. I will absolutely comment on that and note that this was a big part of the conversation last week as well. When I'm thinking about the words that we kept hearing over and over, data centers, hyperscalers were a big part of the conversation. We did a study. We worked with S&P Global to look at load growth. I mean, this is such a hard thing to tackle. And I'll talk a little bit more about that conversation that happened at the technical conference. But we found that there'll be a 35 to 50% increase from 2024 to 2040. There's all kinds of studies that say all kinds of numbers, but I think we all agree it's a big number, and we all agree that we don't know the exact number. And I think what was more even illuminating from the conversation at the FERC technical conference, I was actually listening to a lot of the state commissioners. They had state commissioners from a bunch of different regions, and they talked about the struggle of finding out where and how much data centers are going to be built. And FERC commissioners had really good questions about like trying to dig into, well, why can't you get more information from your utility? And they had lots of good examples of like, well, the utilities have, you know, some insight, and the hyperscalers are absolutely talking to them, but you don't know if they have site control in other parts of the country, and you don't know how much they're going to build. And even if you tell them to put down $1 million, that's nothing compared to the kind of projects they're trying to build. So really, really hard to know how much and where, even when you are a state commissioner, even when you are the utility that they have to work with. So that was a very enlightening part of it. And then going to the generation side of things is resource adequacy, the whole point. And when you ask the question about co-optimization, they obviously have to be considered together. We have to plan for the generation and the transmission together. And that's why I think this whole conversation of resource adequacy is so important. These data centers can be built in 2 years. Generation cannot right now. Maybe in ERCOT, but in other places, they're sitting in interconnection queues for 6 years. And then even when they get through the interconnection queue, there are all kinds of supply chain issues. Right now, gas turbines, you cannot get one for 5 years. And PJM is showing us a cliff they're about to go off in 2029. So the math isn't working as far as the ability to build. And then I think when we think about resource adequacy, absolutely building the things is so important. But Commissioner Dykes was spot on about, you know, we need all the resources on as soon as possible. We need to take every electron from the water and the ground and the sun and the air. So really, this isn't a competition about who's better, but from the way I see it, and the research that we're trying to do at ACP, when we're looking at like different markets and the kind of outcomes they're having. We look a lot at ERCOT because they're building things the fastest. Things are getting interconnected quickly. So the newer technologies, they are building by far a ton of storage, more than any other state. And, you know, they're not a policy state. They're building it because of economics. And they're having these really amazing outcomes with this diverse mix of both wind and storage and gas, and they still have coal online. And when things go awry, when conditions get really tight, the grid is reliable. They're also able to build transmission quicker, I think, than other parts. And also their prices they don't spike as high because they're not, they don't have to avail themselves of these high gas prices, for example. So really, again, it's not that one type of generation is better than the other, but when you get a diverse mix of all of them working together, you can use all of their strengths and weaknesses. And just a couple other observations about the technical conference. It was standing room only. The first day I went, I had to go in the overflow room. And these things, this is recorded, right? So people can sit from their computer and watch, but I think people felt it was so important to actually go there and be in the room. This conversation is long overdue. Kudos to Chair Christie for hosting this conversation and for pulling together all of these people in the room. I think there was a ton of conversation about load growth. I already told you about some of the conversation about state commissioners. Some conversation about transmission, not enough about interregional. I talked a little bit in my comments about interregional value and how when we think about all the solutions we need to quickly meet the load growth, when we are stuck in these tight timelines, we have to send the right price signal to things like interregional transmission, because it's if not, we may be overbuilding, we may not be meeting our timelines. But from my vantage point and talking to my members, these price signals matter. This is how they decide where to invest and how to invest. So getting that resource adequacy price signal to all the things, including interregional, could be a game changer.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a bunch of things that I want to dive into what you said, but we'll just stick to load growth just really briefly. So I want to be sure we have time for the affordability questions and discussion as well. But does anyone have any thoughts on, in addition to what Carrie said, things that we need to do to have the grid be ready for the load growth that is coming? And Jeff, I see you went off mute, so I'll have you go first.
Yeah, and I'll just focus on one piece of this, which others have mentioned and Carrie mentioned as well, which is most recently there is really the load forecasting piece. We were just about a week and a half ago, we're part of a broad subset of customer groups who have asked the commission to lead a conversation on load forecasting because it really is a building block for the planning we need to do to meet this load growth. I'll let others talk about some of the specific planning. To be sure, load forecasting has always been complicated and challenging. And we are now dealing with load forecasting challenges on a magnitude scale we haven't seen maybe ever in the electric system. But what we can benefit from is an industry-wide conversation with really led by FERC and the states. We really hope that FERC and the states will do this jointly to look at several key parts of load forecasting, right? What are the inputs we're using? Do we have some regional consistency around those inputs so that when we get to the regional level to plan for the future, we have some sense of what each other is doing when we're looking at load forecasts? When we're looking at a big new load growth addition, what are we asking of that big new load growth before we add it to the forecast? How real is that? What are we doing to try to understand that it's real? And overarching all of this is really transparency. Do customers have a good sense of what's going into that utility load forecast? Do neighboring utilities know what each other's doing? Those are some of the things that we think are ripe for an urgent conversation right now and really are the building blocks to getting that grid of the future to meet load growth.
Great. I'm going to pull in a piece too here about the extreme weather events, which a few people have touched on, and we also have some questions in the Q&A about it, so I'll try to summarize a few of those questions. So related to extreme weather events and or load growth, really, but there's becoming more opposition to transmission exports during these weather event scenarios, including from state regulators, but also other stakeholders, largely due to the resulting price increases that can occur within the exporting control area. So a lot of transmission operators are believing that assisting neighbors is imperative, but they still have to deal with that increasing opposition. Wondering if you all have any thoughts of how we can address sort of the talking points on this or how to combat that opposition.
Yeah, happy to jump in here. This is something that we're thinking a lot about and is certainly part of the analysis that we're doing when we're studying these various lines of the impacts both directions and impacts to all of the regions that we're connecting. And that is important that there are benefits to all of the communities along and on either end of the line. That's an incredibly important and critical piece to building a successful infrastructure project, is to kind of bringing along and building a community of support and recognizing the various levels of stakeholders, from the landowners that are hosting the project all the way to the consumers in the various regions. So we are thinking about this, and what I would say is, while for that one specific event, maybe you're exporting and prices are increasing in your region, but on a whole, if you're looking at the year or the season, there's going to be this give and take, and each region is going to kind of experience these events differently. One region might be okay for one winter storm, the next storm or summer heat wave, they might be the ones needing to import the power. And so ultimately, interregional transmission lowers the overall cost and reduces the overall cost of building the system. And that's the really critical element. And you see in these extreme weather events that consumers can take an enormous hit. These are extremely costly events. They're tail events, but they're extremely costly, and consumers can be paying for them for 20, 30, 40 years. So while there might be small spikes or price spikes that they might not otherwise experience if they didn't have the ability to export. Ultimately, everyone's going to be exporting and importing at different times. And we think as a whole, if you look at the, seasons and then annual forecasts, it all kind of evens out in the end.
That's great.
I think,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add one thing to what Madeline said. I totally agree with her about particularly emphasizing how costly and devastating to consumers these price spikes can be. Some consumers may be exposed to them more readily, and that can create real affordability problems. But the even bigger problem is them compounding over each other over 20 years, and suddenly we have all of these costs. I will say though, in terms of how interregional transmission is accessing, a lot of times what that's doing is relieving congestion that is actually resulting in generators that would otherwise be available being curtailed. So, I think that some people may be proceeding from an assumption that we're always removing generation from one region to send it to another. And I think this is where well-planned interregional links comes in, right? A lot of times what we're really doing is accessing existing available generation that is being curtailed and moving that generation. So I don't think we're always in that situation where you're sort of taking supply from one place and moving it to another. You're really creating additional supply.
Yeah, certainly. And something I heard from what you said, Madeline, makes me think of often we talk about, or we hear this pushback of interregional transmission is just so expensive. Like the transmission portion of our bills are increasing, right? And that's true if you're comparing it to transmission costs from yesterday or from a decade ago. But if you were to look out 10 years from now, 20 years from now, building the transmission is cheaper than the bills would be if we didn't build it right. And I think that piece of, are we looking backwards in our comparison? Are we looking forwards? Is kind of missed, like that nuance is missed when we're talking to folks. So it's just something that has always struck me. And Commissioner Dykes, I would like you to kind of build on that to the extent that you can, and then I'll open it up to others of, can you talk about how that transmission does help translate into lower bills for customers in any of the topics that we've talked about, right? Like let's build on the affordability piece of this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you touched on one of the most important communication challenges that we have around transmission planning and investment, which is helping, we all, I'm guessing if you're watching this webinar, you probably can be counted in the ranks of the energy, nerds who are, thinking about the cost of these resources in the context of future, forecasts of future prices, and with all of the pressure on supply, coming from load growth and so on and so forth, we know that those future prices are significantly higher than where we are today, and some regions of the country are already experiencing those impacts in bill increases that are hitting as we speak, but that's not true for everyone. And I think that consumers are waking up to these questions and have a lot of anxiety around where these bills are going and why. And so I think that it's really important, I'll say, at the state level, that we're keeping an eye on, every opportunity for keeping costs down as we're building the infrastructure that we need. And that's why those conversations with ratepayers around, the need for these investments, we want to be positioned to be able to explain how we feel confident that we've chosen the cheap, the most affordable or the highest value option compared to alternatives. That's where proactive transmission planning comes in, that we've accurately, to Carrie's point, I think this was a really interesting takeaway from the FERC technical conference. So we've accurately, we're confident that the load growth that's driving these investments is real, and that we're not overbuilding. I think the work that we're trying to do around cost allocation, making sure that one state, one utilities ratepayers aren't shouldering more of the costs than necessary, wringing every possible cost savings out of permitting reform, and really trying to bulletproof our siting and permitting processes to reduce friction and soft costs that can exacerbate the cost of delivering a project. I'll also say that we in Connecticut have been taking a hard look at other cost drivers and trying to make as much room on the bill for the new investments that are necessary as we can. And so we've noticed that we've had a significant increase in costs associated with asset condition projects here in the Northeast that to our view have not gotten adequate scrutiny for prudence and need and for opportunities for cost containment. This is where advanced transmission technologies can come into play and grid enhancing making sure that all of those dollars that are flowing through our transmission bill, which is now accounting for about 11% of the average residential electric bill. That's a significant increase over the last couple of years here in New England. We've got some legislation enacted here at the state level last week that will provide for more assurance of oversight on some of those other portions of our transmission investment portfolio that in our view could benefit from a little more transparency and scrutiny. And it's all in the spirit of trying to make sure that as we look ahead and we see that we need to build and that costs aren't what they, are going to be significant, that we will have the best shot at retaining the trust and the confidence of our ratepayers, that we are stewarding those dollars as carefully and effectively as we can, at a moment that we have to also work really fast. So I think that's why, speaking to the language of affordability, it's really important to think about that conversation very holistically, not just about why it's a good justification for building more and building new things, but also how we can stay in a credible and an honest conversation with the folks at the end of the day who are going to have to pay for all this on their bills.
Yeah, certainly. This is awesome. I know the 4 or 5 of us could keep going on this for another couple hours, but unfortunately we only have 2 minutes left. So I'm just going to do kind of final words and we'll go out the way we came in. So I'll start with you, Carrie. Anything that you want to add to the conversation? 30 seconds or left. What do we need to do to change?
I think I just, I love talking about affordability and reliability, and they definitely go hand in hand. I think an interesting and eye-opening exercise is to look at the interregional, the way electrons flow in tight conditions. Like Winter Storm Elliott, bad things happened to PJM, but there was a time at the beginning of that storm that power was being sent south to MISO, right? Like it happens in SPP when you look at Winter Storm Uri. SPP was receiving a lot of electrons, and they obviously fared much better than an ERCOT that is not well connected. I was saying nice things about ERCOT, but they're not well connected to their neighbors. And I started my remarks about New Orleans. Again, they're not well connected to their surrounding areas. So remember, that's a really important part. You don't know how bad you need interregional until you are in an emergency situation and you wish you would have done a lot more.
Yeah, certainly. Jeff, final words?
Yeah, no, we didn't get to talk about the map. We'll do that another time, folks. If folks want to connect with me, we'll talk about the map. But no, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think, what I would leave folks with is we have a lot to do to plan the grid that we need to meet all of these objectives for the future. And we know that is going to take some time. We know we're a little bit behind. And so I think, in addition to really getting moving on planning this transmission, we also need to be really prioritizing flexibility in how we integrate. I'll leave you with an interesting statistic that has stuck with me is data center operators recently were polled, and 60% of them said, 90% of them said, if I couldn't get a grid connection today, I would start to do things like building my own generation and things like that. They then asked those folks, does that mean you're going to just stay off the grid forever? And 65% of them said, no, we want a grid connection in the future because we know how important it is to have a grid connection to our business. So I think that that's an important reminder that we need to stay in this for the long term, even as we race to get some of these large loads on today, and as we race to do everything we can to preserve affordability for customers. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Madeline?
Yeah, thanks again for this discussion. And I think we've been talking a lot about the importance and value that interregional transmission can bring. And as Carrie was noting, we need to be sending the right signals to encourage these types of high value projects and investment in the right spots on the grid. And one of the ways that we can do that is working in these different RTOs on having a consistent methodology to calculate capacity value of these transmission lines that can enable resource sharing without a capacity value that can be integrated into their various resource adequacy assessments and planning and capacity procurement processes. That value is under-recognized or unaccredited or uncompensated. So you can use kind of existing processes to apply to these specific lines. And then this resource adequacy contribution of interregional transmission can be incorporated either by reducing a particular load-serving entity's capacity obligation or accrediting and compensating the specific owner of that transmission line. So that's one way to encourage these types of investment that can ultimately deliver the affordability and reliability attributes that we're looking for.
Thank you. And then Commissioner Dykes, I know you had a hard stop. You stuck around. Any final words?
Just again, thank you for highlighting resource adequacy and affordability. It's so important that they're part of the conversation around transmission. Any conversation you participate in on these topics, you come away with, of course, long lists of challenges. But I have to say, I think that we've made a lot of strides over the last few years. There is a lot of momentum, in part because I think we're much more clear-eyed, not just about the challenges, but about the just the basic need for investment in transmission. Transmission has really, I think, in the last 2 to 3 years, become something that went from, an invisible essential asset to being something that's at the forefront of conversations about how we can support electrification and load growth and national security. And so that makes me optimistic for all the different progress that's going to be emerging over the next couple of years. So thanks so much for bringing us together.
This is great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining. The webinar, as always, will be recorded and posted so we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much. Have a good one, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.